Hi, biology students. It's Professor Gideon here. I'm recording the Lecture 13, Immunology Part 1. However, I'm going to record this in what I think is going to be 4 lecture videos. So we take it in little chunks together. So my first video, I would like to introduce you to the concept of the immune system. So you're probably aware that the immune system is a really important part of our body. It is extremely powerful in what it's able to do. And here, this diagram is showing us some of the important organs involved in our immune system. So the immune system, when we talk about the immune system, a lot of times it's actually referred to as the lymphatic system. And so the organs that make up the immune system make up our lymphatic system. The important ones that you should know in this diagram would be the thymus. So this is a gland that's right above the heart, as you can see in our diagram. The spleen, lymph nodes, which in this diagram look like they are located in this woman's shoulders or armpits. And they are there. However, lymph nodes can be all over the body. Okay, so they're in the neck, they're in the armpits, they're in the groin. So they're also in various other parts of the body. Also, the tonsils are an important part of the lymphatic system. And so the lymphatic system includes these organs, but then also these vessels. So you see these lymphatic, it's labeled here as lymphatic duct or lymphatic vessels. And these are really similar to circulatory vessels. And in fact, white blood cells can move into the blood, but primarily our white blood cells are transported in lymphatic vessels, which contain a clear fluid called lymph. And basically what that clear fluid is made up of, it's made up of leukocytes, which that's a scientific term for a white blood cell, which I'll abbreviate WBC for white blood cell, as well as a specialized type of leukocyte that we call lymphocytes. Okay, so leukocytes and lymphocytes would be located in lymph, and lymphatic vessels would act as a transport for those white blood cells, although it is possible for those blood cells to leave lymphatic vessels and enter circulatory system. It's also possible for those white blood cells to leave lymphatic vessels and enter the tissues. So we see that play out as well as we discuss the immune system. So the purpose of the immune system. So the purpose of our immune system is to protect our body from invading microorganisms. That's really its main job. So when we encounter bacteria, when we encounter fungi, when we encounter viruses in our environment, and those microorganisms enter the body, the immune system is designed to act as a protective barrier against invasion So there's parts of the immune system that we consider barriers to microorganisms. And then we also have players, so characters in the story here. Mostly we're talking leukocytes and lymphocytes, but other things as well, proteins as well, that play a role in the immune system that help in protecting us from these invaders. So when we begin talking about the immune system, we divide it into two general categories of defense. So these two general categories of defense would be nonspecific immunity, and another name for that would be innate immunity. And this type of immunity is sort of a one-size-fits-all approach for keeping out microorganisms and preventing microorganisms from taking hold inside the body. So when we use that word nonspecific, understand that this is the same response used for protection against all pathogens. Remember that word pathogen? It means disease-causing microorganism, because not all microorganisms are disease-causing. And a lot of them, we've talked specifically about bacteria that have a beneficial role in our environment and in our bodies as well. So we're really talking here about the pathogens, trying to keep the pathogens out. Okay, so we have the nonspecific immunity. And when we talk about that, we usually describe that as a line of defense. So a lot of times we use this terminology, first line of defense and second line of defense. And we'll describe in a little more detail what that entails. Okay, so let's contrast nonspecific immunity, or what we call innate immunity, with the second branch of the immune system, which we call specific immunity. Also known as adaptive immunity. And so adaptive immunity, the beauty of this is that this is an immune response that targets, so the response targets a specific pathogen. This is different than innate. Innate responses, same response. Remember, it's the one-size-fits-all approach, and it's kind of going in that order. So first and second line of defense mechanisms will act as protective barriers, and then if that is ineffective, then specific immunity is initiated. And so another really important part of adaptive immunity, which, by the way, we oftentimes refer to this as, we'll write it up here, third line of defense. So we really describe the immune system in terms of these lines of defense, where there's 1, 2, and 3 lines of defense. So the adaptive immune response is the third line of defense. And a really important component of the adaptive response is the production of memory cells. So memory cells are created to produce long-lasting immunity to a specific pathogen. And this is the principle of why vaccines work. So vaccines work because we are able to activate the adaptive immune response of our bodies to create memory cells that will patrol the body and wipe out that particular pathogen if that pathogen ever invades your body or you come in contact with it. And of course, you also acquire memory from a natural infection to a specific pathogen. So in this overview video, I would like to describe the overview, the players or the parts of the first and the second line of defense. And then we'll really cover that adaptive immune response in some future videos. I think right now I will mention that the players of, the key players in the third line of defense for later, we'll talk about the T cells and the B cells. That's who we're talking about when we talk about third line of defense. So what is the first line of defense? Well, let's take a look. So our largest organ is the skin. Now this is going to make up our first line. Okay, our first line of defense. So one example would be the skin. Skin being a very protective barrier, it's our largest organ, covers our entire body, and new skin cells are constantly being created by mitosis and sloughed off and replaced. And so microorganisms that reside on our skin are constantly being sloughed off with those dead skin cells. In addition to that, there are chemicals present on the skin. Here they're talking about sebum that lubricates the skin, protects the skin. That's just basically oils. So oily skin, that's actually protecting your skin from invasion from skin bacteria. Here we have the mucociliary escalator. I love that word. I think that's a cool word. And it talks about the ciliated cells. So in our respiratory tract is lined with all of these ciliated cells. And in this picture, what we are seeing is a microscopic view of those ciliated cells. Remember, cilia are these little hairs. So you see all these little hairs. So all of the cells that line your trachea, and so the trachea is connecting your mouth to your lungs, and all of those tracheal cells are lined with cilia, and they act like little fingers, little hairs. And what they do is they move and they propel the bacteria that we breathe in and the viruses and all the stuff that we breathe in. It propels that stuff out of the lungs. We don't want pathogens to get into the lungs because the lungs are a very vulnerable part of our body. It's a very important part of your body because that's where your gas exchange occurs. So in the lungs, this is where we're getting our oxygen. Oxygen gas is diffusing into the lungs in very small capillaries. And this is the only way that you get your oxygen that you need for cellular respiration, which we just spent a whole unit learning about why oxygen is so important in that electron transport chain. Remember, as the final electron acceptor, oxygen is key in cell respiration. So this is why the lungs are so vulnerable. And you want to make sure the immune system is trying to propel everything out. So they refer to it as a mucociliary escalator. And that's also, it's not the cilia that's lining our respiratory cells, but also there's a mucus layer. And that mucus layer also is going to trap microorganisms, and it's just going to push them out, and push them into the esophagus, because where we have the trachea here leading to the lungs, there's a parallel tube that you may be aware of. You may be aware of your anatomy pretty well at this point, that, hey, there is the esophagus, a tube next to the trachea, and if that, let's draw the arrow going this way, so if what you're breathing in gets pushed into the, so we're pushing out of the trachea into the esophagus, and so if that material gets pushed into the esophagus, where does the esophagus go? Dun, 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 dun. That's right, into the stomach. And what is in the stomach? Acid. That's right. We have this internal acid bath called the stomach, and that low pH is really critical to denaturing proteins found on microorganisms. So it's part of first line of defense. Okay, so pushing things into the stomach where those microorganisms are denatured and destroyed, that's a really important part of our protection from pathogens. Okay, so let's summarize first line of defense. So when we talk about first line of defense, we're really talking about physical and chemical barriers to infection. So what's gonna be a physical or chemical barrier to prevent the infection? So we just talked about skin being our largest organ, and with all the oils, constant replacement of new skin cells. All right, so we talked about the cilia and the mucus lining our respiratory tract, lining cells of the respiratory tract. We call that the mucociliary escalator. In talking about the mucociliary escalator, we also mentioned the stomach. So stomach acid would be part of first line of defense. I also want you to recall lysozyme. So recall the very last lab you got to do before we wrapped up our in-person semester was the lysozyme lab. And so recall, this is an enzyme in saliva and tears. And do you remember what bacteria it is effective at destroying? That's right, it's the gram-positive bacteria. So this is an enzyme that breaks peptidoglycan, PG, peptidoglycan, effective against gram-positive bacteria. So in our lab experiment, we found that it was most effective against gram-positive bacteria. The example was Micrococcus luteus. In that experiment, wasn't effective against Serratia, the pink bacteria, because Serratia is gram-negative and has that outer membrane to protect. Okay, so those are the main ones. Let's see what else. Other types of hairs, like nose hair, would also be an anatomical or physical barrier that we have to infection. But any type of mucus layers as well. So here, let's detail out second line of defense. So first and second line of defense, recall, are part of nonspecific immunity. And I'm going to do some future videos about the key players in the second line of defense. So the big parts of second line of defense, the leukocytes. So we're going to do a whole lecture on the leukocytes next. Okay, and their roles and all the details about those. So leukocytes would be second line of defense. Second part of second line of defense, and this is all initiated and controlled by leukocytes also, would be the fever response. So when our body produces a fever response, it does that in response to signal molecules that are secreted by leukocytes called cytokines. More about that later. And by the way, why does the fever response help in the fight against pathogens? Well, if you recall, our normal body temperature is 98.6 Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. And that also happens to be the optimal temperature range for human pathogens. So if that body temperature increases, even just by a few degrees, that high temperature denatures proteins. And that is why the fever response is part of our innate immunity. When you get a fever, that's telling you you have an infection in your body that is being recognized by leukocytes, and it's triggering a physiological response that causes your brain, actually your hypothalamus, to reset the temperature of the body and to initiate physiological responses, like increased metabolism and things that are going to cause your body temperature to raise. And the purpose of that is to slow the replication of the pathogen in your body. So I always think about that when I run a fever for myself. If it's a low-grade fever like 100 or 101, a lot of times I'll let myself, if I'm able, run a fever because I recognize this is my own body fighting the pathogen. And when we take those fever reducers, like we take the Tylenol, we take the ibuprofen, those fever fever medicines, they actually block the signaling molecules of your white blood cells and they hinder your immune system. So if it's a low-grade fever, I recommend letting your body actually run that fever. The danger is, because fevers can be dangerous, and let me just tell you, your immune system is very powerful. It has the power to kill you instantaneously, okay? Within minutes, your immune system could kill you. This happens sometimes, obviously, sometimes in response to pathogens, sometimes in response to allergies. There are some people who have allergies to all sorts of things. Right now I'm thinking bees, right? People who have allergies to bees, bee stings, they carry with them EpiPens. And those EpiPens are epinephrine. That's actually a hormone that you give yourself that blocks your immune system. So these are people that have a overactive or an allergy response. That's what allergies are. It's an overreactive immune response. And that reaction to a bee sting can kill you, and it can kill somebody, and they go into what's called anaphylactic shock, and they can die. And that's why they carry with them the EpiPen to save their life, to give themselves an injection of a hormone blocker that will block the action of these very, very powerful cytokines. So do not underestimate the power of your immune system. High fevers can be deadly. Why? Well, because our own proteins function best at the optimal temperature range of human body temperature. So you go high, you go 104 and higher in your fever, in your body temperature, guess what? You're denaturing your own proteins. you're causing cell death, and that can cause brain damage. It can be particularly damaging to infants. So infants, even just temperatures of 100 and 101 are not recommended, and we recommend treating with baby Tylenol. But it is part of your second line. Okay, it's an innate response. Okay, third part of second line of defense, inflammation. So inflammation has a purpose. We're going to do a whole video on it, describe the stages, but the inflammation does have a purpose, and that purpose is to locate white blood cells to a location of infection, and for the purpose of those white blood cells to clear out that infection. So that's sort of the big picture of inflammation. More on that later. Another big part of second line of defense would be the complement protein system. A lot of people have never heard of this before, and so we'll describe them in more detail and what they do in a future video. So that's all for the first lecture video on the overview of the immune system.